Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to iNN's Headlines and Beyond. My name is Dr. Daniel Karras. This is the sixth week edition, the weekend edition for the Headlines and Beyond. So it's the 6.3 week edition. So that's our show number. And as I said, you're going to find things here that you're not going to find anywhere else. We do present a different point of view, and we look at questions and answer things in a way that other media outlets just simply don't do. And as we move forward, we're going to change up the format bit by bit. We're going to change the amount of times we come to you. I am scaling back to twice a week, basically on the weekends and on a Wednesday. So there's going to be a new format. There's going to be a midweek edition, and then there's going to be a weekend edition, and that will sort of tie everything together. There isn't enough happening. There isn't enough time to put together 3 editions a week. So only 2 editions. And the thing is there's a lot of information here, so it does take a bit of time to go through everything. You're not going to get everything once, so there is going to be a bit of repetition between the editions as we talk about different events and how they interconnect with the larger scope of the geopolitics that is currently going on. As well, we're going to also look at see how this fits into history and the different areas that you should be looking into. I had stated before, I had given you 2 books to read. I said it was George Orwell's 1984 and Niccolo Machiavelli, The Prince. That was late 1600s. That has to be read as no. I say has to because without these 2 authors, a large chunk of what's going on today will not be properly understood within its historical context. And a lot of times we think these things are new, that the events that are going on in the news is new. It's something that's brand new, that's never occurred before. But if you read in history, you'll find out that this is something that has occurred before, and that there's a dynamic to this that can be understood from reading these 2 particular authors here in these particular 2 books. Now we're going to eventually expand on this and go into something larger in terms of our reading, because you do have to keep up your background reading. This is your background reading. This is your background research. This is something that has to be done if you really do intend to be understanding of the situations that are going on. Well, so without that, you're not going to have that. So in this case here, we are the show is entitled Stepping Forward. And stepping forward means that we are going to be sort of upping the ante, moving the ball forward in terms of where we are as a journalistic source. And the thing is, using journalism to really change the world. And I do have several avenues that I will be taking to, we'll be using to sort of fulfill this agenda of stepping forward. And that means simply not writing about it, not just simply observing the stuff, but getting involved and really trying to make a change, trying to make a difference. And the first step I'll be making is into the sex professionals of Canada, and I will be trying to put together an education program that will allow the sex workers, if they want to come out of where the situation they're in, to open up their opportunities in the world to sort of get the education that they maybe may have missed out on, to sort of just basically change their lives for the better. I've done a fair amount of research on sex professionals in the sex industry, and I do not think at all that and I'm going to call them slaves, the properties, the sex professionals, I do not think at all that they are happy, ultimately at the end of the day, that they are happy with where they are. They're there simply because they don't see any other option for themselves. In other words, this wasn't specifically a conscious choice They grew up saying, I'm going to be a prostitute, I'm going to be a sex worker. This was something that they had to adjust to, something they had to put their minds around, and develop a sense of, it's a mental sense of accepting, not necessarily willingly accepting, but accepting the situation that they're in, and put themselves in a mental state that doesn't destroy them. In other words, we see a face that is the face of survival, that is the face of, I can't get myself out of this, but I'm also not going to be depressed at the same time. In other words, we see a facade, a created front that is very sociable in its own sense. And we mistake this to say, well, maybe there's consent here, that they're consenting to this stuff. And the answer is no, they're not consenting. This is simply a psychological conditioning. Their psychology has conditioned them to the social amenability, the social aptitude, the social outwardness, in order to survive what they view as being horrible. So, well, understanding this says, well, it may be a deviation from what we're talking about in geopolitics, but it's not necessarily a deviation from what's going on in politics. Because, again, sitting down doing the research, I found out most of the women who are trafficked, they're being trafficked to people who are political higher-ups. In other words, the power of politics creates a situation where wealthy and powerful men can buy human beings. They can buy whatever they want, and they can get away with it because of their position in power. And this thinking, this psychological thinking, so the evils of power, the psychology of evil, which is firmly implanted in power and money, affects how the geopolitics actually works. And you have to realize that this is there in order to change geopolitics, in order to produce a better world. The evils of the world, the evil politicians, the evil leaders, the evil people with money, have to be dealt with. These things have to be dealt with in a manner that is progressive. And I'm not using the term progressive and talking about being a socialist thing. I'm talking about being progressive, but actually producing some degree of positive change. In other words, making things move towards what's better. And this is a difficult thing because you're not going to change things immediately. It's an incremental change. It's an incremental progress, not a total leap of change. It's not an instant change all at once. It is essentially moving things forward. And this is where we can talk about the Israeli Nazis, American colonialism, American terrorists, American brinksmanship. And this is all things that came up, Obama's Cold War now. And it wasn't necessarily Obama's Cold War. In the beginning, this came from the Republican House. Adam Kinzinger created a bill called H.R. 758, which had essentially outlined the parameters for a Cold War against Russia. Obama did not have to sign this bill into law. He could have just left it and had an empty blank statement. Obama signed this into law, and that law, as of January 1st, pushed the United States into an official position of Cold War with Russia. This is not a good thing because the last Cold War, which we did win, was not started by us. We didn't start the last Cold War. We responded to it. This time, we, the Americans, the free people, the people who call themselves free, we're the ones who started this war. It is not a good idea to start a war, particularly if you really can't finish it. And the United States has not been able, we've seen this in Iraq, we see this in Afghanistan, the United States has not been able to finish a war. We go in there, we meddle, within 2 years, we're tired of it, or we're distracted, and we want out because, well, there's no more public interest in what's going on. And we see this with ISIS. We have Anderson Cooper and Senator John McCain for the first few years up there saying we have to support the Free Syrian rebels. We have to support the Free Syrian Army. And then there was a lag where they weren't saying much of anything. All of a sudden, within 2 years, ISIS emerges. And they emerge with American weaponry. And if you watch many people don't watch, if you watch C-SPAN, you watch the different committees, you know that the American Congress was applying the Syrian Free Army with weapons. That this stuff was given to the army. You also know that Obama sold Qatar and Saudi Arabia the largest amount of weapons ever. They made a historical sale to Saudi Arabia to Qatar. And the thing is, the jihadists, as I mentioned before, they're Sunni. The Sunnis are supported by Qatar. They're supported by Saudi Arabia. And the thing is that this is a known quantity. There's no way Senator John McCain, who is on the Senate Intelligence Committee, or was on the Senate Intelligence Committee, he was part of the intelligence apparatus, that he didn't know this. So they knew that they were supplying ISIS with weapons. They knew that the Syrian Free Army was ISIS. This was not something that wasn't known to them. And yet at the same time, they created this whole situation for war in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, you can see this. I was reading an article in Der Spiegel. And it's by an author called Thanasis. He's Greek. Thanasis Kambanis, right? Kambanis. Looking at 4 years after the Arab Spring uprising. Well, if anyone actually was bothered reading some of the back pages of Al Jazeera and some of the more Islamic papers that were written in English, they weren't calling, for the beginning, they weren't calling the Arab Spring the Arab Spring. They were calling it the Muslim Spring. They were simply using the centrist Muslims, the centrist Arabs, and the other centrist organizations to create a revolution that would ultimately become Islamic. And this is exactly what we said. We see a destabilization from Tunis to Libya to Egypt, all over the Middle East. And of course, we see after this, we see the destabilization of Syria. We see the destabilization of Lebanon. We see the destabilization of Iraq. In other words, the fires that had been initially started putting out by Bush, and he hadn't done a good job. Bush didn't do a good job at all. It wasn't really a well-done job by Bush. Obama could have gone there and done a lot better. He was supposed to stop a law of the wars. He was supposed to put out a law of the fires as peacemaker. This was his platform. He stood up as a Democrat and said, we are going to be the peacemakers. We are not going to use a firm hand. But where are we now? We're in a Cold War with Russia, destabilization across the Middle East, chaos in Ukraine, all at the hand of Obama's foreign policy. Clearly, we've been lied to as an American public. And yet, in the courts, the news, that's not mentioned. What is talked about, if you watch the more we'll call newsy programs, the programs that are catered towards people who really are supposed to know what they're talking about. These are people who want more meat in their programs. They want to have more information. You have these serious deep talk, these deep voiced interviewers sitting down with people like this is one with Ban Ki-moon talking about his last year at the head of the UN, and this was from Al Jazeera with an English voice there, nice English accent, very nice English accent. There's no better authority than an English accent. If you want to have authority, you want to have what you said believed, then have an English accent. Because that's all you need. That's what to have authority, to have yourself believed in whatever you're saying. Yes, they're talking about aliens. Let's talk about aliens. There are aliens sitting right next to me on my right side. If I go, if there are aliens sitting right next to me outside, using an English voice, right? I can't do it right now. That's not in my head. But if I used an English voice, an English accent, and said the same thing, that there are aliens sitting beside me, even though you can't see it, you would believe it because I have an English voice and an English accent, and that's all the authority you need. But the thing is that the interviewer completely glosses over all the information that is out there and available. They didn't mention how Qatar was caught several times using rigged footage on the issue in Syria. They didn't mention that a lot of times they were using jihadist footage on the issues on Syria. That a lot of the information was stated that they were actually involved. Because don't forget, who's Al Jazeera? They're owned by the Qatar state government. They are a puppet. They are a PR machine for Qatar. If you look into the background, and you see this in their news. Anyways, when we come back, we're going to continue talking about Ban Ki-moon's last year. To continue to talk about the interview that was on Al Jazeera, and how a lot of media, even aimed towards upper level people, more intelligent people, is really rigged and misses out a lot of information that should be in there.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Hi, my name is Dr. Daniel Karras. I'm your host for Headlines and Beyond on iNN. If you like the show we're saying, I do not monetize my channel because there's a lot of copyright issues with this. It creates a lot of problems. So how do I make my money? Well, if you like this show, it's very simple. We do it the PBS format. I ask you for a donation, but I'm not going to ask you for a lot. Or, well, all you have to do is, if you have $1 or $2 in your pocket, take it out, put it in an envelope. I'll give you the address. It will be in the description of my channel. Go to the channel description, go to About, and you'll see the address to send the $1 or $2 that you send. All I'm asking for $1 or $2. If you got $1 or $2 in your pocket, stick it in an envelope. Send it to iNN. That's iNN. The address is 87 Telson Road. It's 87 Telson, Telson Road. That's in Markham, Ontario. Postal code is L3R184. And I thank you for your support. Alrighty.
iNN, provoke, inform, and change. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Welcome back to the other side of our break. As I said in the break there, we are looking for some money. We're doing the sort of the PBS thing where we ask for donations. And we're not asking for a lot. We're asking for $1 or $2. If you've got $1 or $2 in your pocket, just, you feel like doing this, take it out, stick it in an envelope, put our address on it. It's in the description down below, and it's going to be in our About section on YouTube. It will be visible. You can be able to see where you can put send your information to, or send any mail or your donations to. So that's going to be a thing. But anyways, back to this whole issue on Ban Ki-moon and the interview at Al Jazeera. The interviewer really glossed over a lot of stuff. There wasn't a lot of really... He pretended, and this was a great show, to be a serious interviewer. But what a lot of interviewers do to sort of cover for the things that they don't know or the things that they're hiding, they'll ask open-ended questions that really don't have an answer to them, and they allow the politicians to really sort of wiggle around and give non-committal answers. And you've seen this. You've seen this tons of times where the politician answers around the question, but never answers the question directly. And this is the status quo for the political interview. And people walk around and say, "Whoa, wow, this is a great interview." But the thing is, if you look at the actual track record of the UN over the last few years, you see that they failed. The UN has utterly failed in its mandate. Ask yourself the question, is your exempt or not exempt from the International War Crimes Tribunal? And the answer is Europe is exempt from the International War Crimes Tribunal. In other words, you cannot charge a European. You see Europe created the war in Libya. They went in and destabilized Tunisia. They support very heavily. You can see they support very heavily the actions in the Arab uprising that led to chaos and everything, that led to the destabilization. But do you see any European being charged? And the answer is no. No European has been charged in this. No European has even been questioned on this whole thing. And the thing is, this is something that becomes more apparent as you start reading through things. And ask yourself, well, who are the revolutionaries? Who are the terrorists? And to ask yourself the question, you look at the sort of the global situation. You look at the fear levels that are out there, in particular considering the "Je suis Charlie," I am Charles comments, the identity that I am, that the so-called the so-called poster child for freedom, Je suis Charlie, the journalist, the cartoonist who was killed in the attacks in Paris. And you look at this and you go, well, this is Paris's 9/11. And of course, everybody across Europe picked up their their placards and joined in the march. But if you go back to the attacks, the various different attacks that you look at, particularly, let's go outside the European sphere and look at what they call collateral damage in Iraq. Look at the conditions in Iraq. You'll see that the counts for deaths, the so-called collateral damage, the civilian deaths, is around 800 people a month. So that means 8,000 people a year in Iraq are being killed because of the conflict there. And of course, the United States and now the rest of the world has started that. Iraq was destabilized first by Clinton, who spent time and time again bombing Iraq. Every time he was caught under the desk with Monica Lewinsky, and every time these sex scandals appeared, he had the business of the people to do, and he was out there bombing Iraq. Every time he got caught naked, whether it was with his pants down, he went out there and started bombing Iraq. So Iraq was his excuse to not be impeached, and it worked. Most of the media sort of forgave him and say, well, this is his own personal business. Now, ironically, if it was a Republican president, you wouldn't have seen that at all. What you saw with the Republican candidate, let's say one of the candidates for anytime there's a Republican candidate for anything, you always find some woman will come out and say, well, he sexually harassed me, he said bad words to me. So simply saying bad words is enough to impeach a Republican, no matter what position or post that they hold. But a president who is caught repeatedly in an action with a 19-year-old girl at the time, this is his own personal business, and we shouldn't be involved in it. In other words, and the thing is, we now know that Monica Lewinsky was molested by Clinton. We now know that if you look at her, she fits the profile of a victim of sexual abuse. And at the time, everyone, the feminist groups, no one stood up for her. Nobody stood up for Monica Lewinsky. The Monica Lewinsky case demonstrates the reality of what the feminist groups are really about. They had their moment. They had a chance to stand up. and they had a chance to make their mark and say, this is what we're going to do. They had the chance with Condit and his girlfriend. Condit's girl, the senator from, or congressman from California, whose girlfriend was found cut up in this tiny little pieces. Yes, it does look like a hitman. It does look like she was cleaned by the CIA because they found little bone fragments. But we're going to blame this on a homeless person. A homeless person has the ability to cut up the body into tiny little pieces, so the only thing that are left are tiny bone fragments. This is what a homeless man has the ability to do. Now, if you want to believe that, fine. But to me, if you read your CIA notes, if you go in and study clandestine history, you know that the CIA has methods of cleaning up the murder scenes, that they can get rid of a body. They simply, they have these abilities to break up the body and scatter it around so it's very difficult to find. That's a CIA model. That's a CIA signature. You see a body strewn about, bits and pieces, nothing whole, nothing really put together, no evidence. That's a professional hit. That is a professional cleaning job. That is the hallmark of an intelligence operation, not of a random homeless person killing somebody. But of course, the media just glossed over it because, again, we're dealing with a Democrat, and it doesn't matter what the Democrat does because they have no morals, anyways. So it was completely glossed over, and none of the feminist groups stood up and said, hey, wait a minute, let's take a second look at this. And so what happens, you see, in the comparison to Iraq, and you look at the same time what was going on, there was an attack in Nigeria where hundreds of people were killed, but yet the only people who were worth mentioning in that time period were the French, the white people. It's the narrative. It matters when a white European person dies. If a person is not white and not European, it doesn't matter. This is what we see in Israel. The white European Jews matter. The dark Palestinians, non-Europeans, don't matter. We see this continuously in the news. And this is even with the statements, the so-called statements of tolerance, coming from Europe and the so-called humanitarian left, the democratic left, who call themselves humanitarian, but they still have a significant degree of racial intolerance, if you want to call it that. That they are still fundamentally and systematically racist. And we look at the collateral damage. And then as you read through, this is why it does take a while to really sort of do the analysis on a particular thing. Because this just came out now, just a few days ago, January 26th. Following the recent terror attacks in France, French Jews, more than ever before, are planning to emigrate to Israel. Life is expensive and far from perfect, but anti-Semitism in Europe, say many, is becoming intolerable. Just 2 months ago, prior to this, the immigration to France by Israeli Jews was going up. After the attack, it's going down. What you see here is exactly what plays out in the book The Prince, and it also plays out in the book 1984. It is what you see by a state. A state will determine whether or not a military operation is successful depending on its strategic outcome. In other words, if the collateral damage is low enough and the strategic importance is high enough, then an attack is worth it. So look at the attack on France. In France, you had maybe 20 people killed in the attack on French. In Nigeria, you had 100 people killed, 100 people plus. In Iraq, the collateral damage level is 800 innocent people a month. So the France thing, if an Israeli operation wants to do something to push Jews back to Israel, to create a fear, to create the need for an Israeli state, This attack in France, the Jesuit Charlie attack, the attacks in France are more than worth it. There's a strategic benefit. And this is the hallmark of a false flag operation. A false flag operation is where the attack is done by its own state, done by friendlies, in order to create the atmosphere of fear that pulls the nation together, that creates a sense of nationalism. This is in 1984 from George Orwell. This is in The Prince this is in The Prince by Machiavelli. That's why these books are so standard. The Machiavellian book, and this is what, if you ever heard the term Machiavellian politics, that's from the 1700s. George Orwell was 1950. This is 2015. The same mechanisms are in play today. This is why reading the background research is so important. We're seeing the exact same thing here. We're seeing how false flags are produced. We're seeing the evidence for false flags. And we can compare this. We have now evidence. We have background evidence. We have background research to back this up with. To sort of highlight, to put it in a context. So it's not sitting out there, oh, this is some nutbag conspiracy theory. We now see it. We now see the plausibility of it. We're starting to put together the evidence. We're looking at motive. Who would have who would want to do this? And then we're looking at the opportunity to do it. Does a person have the opportunity? Can they do? They have the capacity to pull something. Does Mossad have the capacity to pull off something like that, like the attacks we saw in France? And they do. Everyone knows. Well, anyone who claims that they know international politics should know that the Mossad is capable of pulling off false flag operations. They should have an understanding of what false flag operations are and the strategic advantages to false flag operations in terms of producing foreign policy. This is a known thing. It's not unknown. It's known. And we see the exact same thing with what we saw in France. We saw this with 9/11. 9/11, which changed the entire American world, and actually changed the entire world, because you now see all the security in place, and all that security apparatus had to be purchased. So there was a large expenditure in 9/11 because of these terrorist attacks. If you look at who profited from 9/11, you can now go back and say, okay, these people were also involved in 9/11. That this is the hidden hand behind 9/11. You go look at see who the jihadists are. Who are these? Who is ISIS? You find out that they're all Sunnis. Well, who are the Sunnis? That's Saudi Arabia. That's Qatar. And you find that the United States and Israel has been dumping tons of weaponry into Saudi Arabia and into Qatar. Look at Obama's record on the weapons he sent to Qatar, and you will find your connection. You'll find the hidden hand behind the destabilization of the Middle East. You'll find the hidden hand behind a large chunk of the destabilization of the world. When we come back, we're going to talk about the evils of politics. We're talking about the evils in specific context to the evils of psychology, the psychology of evil. This is where we're going to go next when we come back.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Hi, my name is Dr. Daniel Karras. I'm your host for Headlines and Beyond on iNN. If you like the show we're seeing, I do not monetize my channel because there's a lot of copyright issues with this. It creates a lot of problems. So how do I make my money? Well, if you like this show, it's very simple. We do it the PBS format. I ask you for a donation, but I'm not going to ask you for a lot. Or, well, all you have to do is, if you have $1 or $2 in your pocket, take it out, put it in an envelope. I'll give you the address. It will be in the description of my channel. Go to the channel description, go to About, and you'll see the address to send the $1 or $2 that you send. All I'm asking for, $1 or $2. If you got $1 or $2 in your pocket, stick it in an envelope. Send it to iNN. That's iNN. The address is 87 Telson Road. It's 87 Telson, Telson Road. That's in Markham, Ontario. Postal code is L3R184. And I thank you for your support. Alrighty.
iNN. Provoke, inform, and change. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Welcome back to the other side of the break. We are now into the psychology of evil section. We're going to take a look and see how evil emerges from politicians. As it, much of what we see in the news is pushed by a larger political agenda. These tiny little jihadist groups do not act on their own. There is a larger context to what's going on. There's a larger context to the issues in there. And one is there's an oil factor in there. In a large chunk of these areas where the fighting is going on, where there is this destabilization, oil has been found. There was more recently, before all this issue came up with in Syria, oil is there. Ukraine is an old oil issue. It's not a new oil, it's an old oil issue. Ukraine is Operation Barbarossa. It is the Nazi invasion of Russia. That's what Ukraine is. And this situation is not something new. Operation Barbarossa was not something new. It was done by Napoleon. Napoleon invaded Russia. And if you go into Napoleonic Wars, and you go into the original context, you go back and read the original journals from that time period, they talk about Crimea, they talk about Kiev, but it's all part of Russia. It's not until after the Napoleonic Wars, that the invasion of Russia, that you actually have the creation of Ukrainian identity. And you'll find that this invasion of Ukraine, this invasion of Russia, it goes actually back to 800 AD. You'll find that's where a large chunk of the stuff began. And again, it began with a European invasion of Russia. And the whole view is that the Aryan nation, this Aryan view of the world, this European view of the world, views that anybody who is white in Europe must belong to the Aryan nation, and that all this land belongs to them. This is the fundamental narrative behind Europe and the whole explosion, the empire of Europe, if you will. And this push, this evolution of society has been going on for a long time in terms of the European society. But we see that it changes. Again, as I said, if you're looking for a monolithic conspiracy theory or a monolithic conspiracy, you're not going to find it, because there are large chunks of things that are missing in here. And one of the chunks that are missing has to do with the Illuminati and the whole discussion of Illuminati. And the Illuminati can be used as a generalized term, because the Illuminati really typifies what happens in the Masons, what happens in the Jewish societies known as the Kabbalah societies. A lot of these secret societies are formed like the Illuminati are, but they're not necessarily a singular society. Like Illuminati are not a singular society. It's just simply one example, one more popular example of all the different societies that are out there. And the societies are formed around very wealthy, very powerful people who have their own interests in the outcome of geopolitics and how the world is run. They are there to create empires. That's the whole purpose of these secret societies. And they actually emerged out of the papacy through the Crusades as the Pope divided up Europe and the conquered lands through the Crusades to these various different organizations. And they became very wealthy, very powerful. And at some point in time, the papacy realized that they had become too powerful, they became too much of a threat, and ultimately banned these societies. That's why they became secret societies. They used an excuse that they were heretics, but again, that was simply an excuse. You read the stuff that the Vatican itself were guilty of a lot of things, including the Jesuits themselves. But they needed to get a large chunk of these people out of the way, so a lot of these people went underground and they became secret societies. So, and again, they weren't one group. Illuminati is sort of an umbrella term for a lot of different groups that included the later development of the Masons. And the thing is, it came out of the Crusades. It came out of the Knights Templar. It came out of the Knights Hospitaller. These are the origins here. You have to, if you want to study the origins of these secret societies like the Illuminati, you have to go back to the Crusades and read up and study on the Crusades. This is the origin of the Illuminati. This is the origin of the Masons. This is the origin of the Knights Templar. All these different societies come up from here. And if you want to understand the dynamics of that, that's where you have to go. And the thing is as they did the Crusades, as they went back into to the Middle East, they began bringing back a lot of the texts from the Middle East. At this time, you remember, the Dark Ages was confined to Europe. It wasn't in the East. The East was enlightened. The East had its enlightenment. It was able to see things. It had reading, it had writing, it had books, it had manuscripts. As these manuscripts began drifting back from the Crusades into Europe, these secret societies took up these manuscripts, because in many cases they're the ones who sort of liberated these manuscripts from the libraries that they looted in the East. And as they started reading through the scripts and translating them, a large chunk of the dark magic that was in the East, because there was a lot of paganism, even though Christianity had come in at the time, there was still a lot of paganism there. And it's these dark scripts that became the core of a lot of these secret societies. This includes numerology. If you wonder why they have lucky numbers like lucky number 13 or these lucky different symbols, a lot of this comes out of the East. A large chunk of the stuff that came out of the East includes the Sumerian text. Why is the Sumerian text important? Because the SS, the Nazis, built their entire organization on the Sumerian texts. They believed that somehow the white race were descendants of the Eastern Sumerians. This was their belief. And they created an entire society around this. And a large chunk of these Illuminati are again still related to the Nazis. They're related to the SS. A large chunk of that stuff still is around today. A large chunk of the Nazi stuff is still around today. It's not gone. The public is not told that it's still around, but it's still there. And a lot of the philosophies that come out of the universities are embedded or contain large chunks of the sort of we call it forbidden or hidden knowledge that would come out of the Illuminatis. Again, these particularly the Illuminati societies. And one of the things they're talking about here in this reading through Der Spiegel, and this is an interesting read here. They talk about the myth of humane killing, talking about capital punishment. Of course, anyone who's left, anyone who's in Europe, is fundamentally against capital punishment. Yet at the same time, as they talk about this whole thing about the cruelty of of the death penalty, they have no problem with euthanasia of the elderly. They have no problem with abortion. And the way they define it is, the person who is on death row is a human being. The elderly person and the child within the womb, the fetus, are not human beings, so therefore they're all right to kill. Now remember, if you go back into history, who weren't human beings being sent to the death camps? Well, they were both the Jews and the Slavs. The Slavs and the Jews weren't human beings. Anyone who was not properly Aryan wasn't a proper human being. They were defective, and they were sent into these euthanasia camps. That's what the death camps were, to be euthanized, because, well, these are sick, defective people here. They're just sick, defective animals because they don't have a soul anymore. If you're a humanist, there is no human soul. There is no God. It's fundamentally atheistic, and you've got a defective person there, like a defective animal. What do? You put the animal down. You put it to sleep, as they say. And that's the term euthanasia. Euthanasia is a Greek term for happy death. That this death is somehow happy. And so you see the evolution of the death camps into abortion and into now euthanasia. In Canada, just sort of the Canadian Supreme Court confirmed that Canada is now has gone far enough to the left that Canada has now become a psychopathic society, and you can now, if you can remove some group of people from the definition of being human, they're now candidates for euthanasia. Elderly, sick people who are defective, can now be put to death happily through euthanasia. Fetuses are not human beings. They can be put to death. Well, they can be stopped from living, which is death. Because that's what abortion means, to stop. So you're stopping. The abortion is they're aborting the process of life inside of this thing, because they no longer call it a human being anymore. It's now been removed from the definition of life in a human being. And so now this thing is now permissible to stop its life. Again, they're not going to call it murder because it's not a human being. And of course, animal rights activists really don't care. I mean, they have more interest in the cute puppy. You know, ooh, how can you kill this? And they show a picture of a puppy out there. Than they do with a human being, right? Puppy, human being. Who's worth more, puppy or human being? The puppy is worth more. Because they've dehumanized the person to a point where it's no longer even a puppy. It's not even worth a puppy. It's now nothing. And of course, this whole concept of nothingness is nothing new because they view life as conceptual. And so, of course, now you can be any gender you want to be. Well, even if you don't, let's say, if you want to make up a gender, you can make up a gender because now there's mixed gender, there's gender confusion, there's a whole bunch of different terms out there now for the types of genders that you can be. And the thing is, if things are conceptual, they're talking about, wow, it's how you feel, it's not necessarily about biology. Well, if that's the case, then I feel like a dog. Maybe I'm a dog. You know, I can walk around, woof, woof, and, you know, put on a collar or something like that. And, hey, you can't say anything about it. Animal rights. But, of course, the human being has no rights. And the thing is, they say, well, at the same time, we need to control society. There's a whole thing about controlling society in here. And we've seen this. We've seen this in the Stanford University experiment. We see, that was Dr. Philip Zimbardo. We see the Stanley Milgram experiment, in where they get people under authority, they get these subordinates to create torture. How do you take a nice human being with conscience, and get them to do torture? That's what the Stanley Milgram experiment. And where do we see this? We saw this in the Nazis, because that's why Stanley Milgram did the experiment. His claim was we wanted to see why the Nazis did it within, and how they could do it. How do you take an ordinary person, a subordinate, a bureaucrat, and turn them into a monster that produced the death camps? Well, we see the exact same Stanley Milgram experiment being done at the TSA, in the border guard. The border cross. Look at the border cross. Look at the horrors that are going on the border crossing. And a lot of it isn't getting into the news, but if you go onto YouTube and look at the abuse that's going on there, this is a Stanley Milgram experiment. Further, if you see what's going on inside, the abuse that's going on inside the prisons, that's the Stanford University experiment. We see the psychology of evil at work every day in our world today, and we see it growing, and it's growing because of the left. The so-called humanists are not really humanists. They talk about humanism and philanthropy as their rhetoric, as their ideology, but the reality of it is torture. It's painful. It's subjugation. And this is where we see this coming out now from both the Talmud and in the Quran. We see the emergence of the sexual slave, the non-human being, the non-existent person. And we see this in the caste system, the Hindu caste system, with the temple prostitution. That this prostitution is now okay. We now have, these people are destined by God. They're fated by God to be prostitutes. This is their life, and this is why they were born. And we see this in the Quran. We see this in the Talmud. We see this in the Hindu system. And what we see is that when the Catholics, at 1000 AD, emerged, they did the exact same thing. The Christian God, the original Christian God, was not a war god. He was a god of peace. The Western Christians, the Europeans, couldn't have that. They needed a war god. And what they did is the Catholic Church, 1000 AD, changed the theology fundamentally and created a new Christian war god. They became pagans again. But the name of the god, the name of the pagan god, was Christ. And we see the God Almighty. You see the paintings on the Sistine Chapel. They say, oh, that's very pagan. It looks like Zeus. Well, yeah, that's exactly what happened. They went back to the pagan gods. They put the paganism that was initially there in the Roman Empire. They brought it back again. They brought back the slavery. They brought back the divine control of by leaders, particularly the Pope, because the Pope became the vicar of Christ. He took the place of Christ on earth. He was God on earth. This is the infallibility of the Pope. The infallibility of the papacy stems from the vicar of Christ, the title vicar of Christ, which in the Greek term, if you understand the Greek word antis, in the term antis Christos, right? Antis Christos. Antis, right? Two words. Antis Christos. That means Antichrist. Vicar of Christ is synonymous with the term Antis Christos, Antichrist, if you understand the Greek. And what we see here is we see the emergence of an Antichrist church. And from this Antichrist church, all the denominations, including the Protestants, and if you look at the term Protestant, you don't see the term, there's no D in there. What you see is the term Protestant. They become Protestant. They become protesters of the Antichrist Pope. And their view of the Antichrist Pope is the Pope should have no authority. And what they do is they take the mutilated, the fundamentally shifted theology, remove the Pope, but keep the war aspect. They keep the authority, but the authority is now removed from the Pope and given to the King and Queen. From there, from the evangelists take this thing and divide it even further into a democratic system. So our democratic system, which you talk about the Christian right are still pagans. They're still fundamentally pagan because they believe in a pagan Christ. That's the theology. And when we come back, we'll talk more about that.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Hi, my name is Dr. Daniel Karras. I'm your host for Headlines and Beyond on iNN. If you like the show we're seeing, I do not monetize my channel because there's a lot of copyright issues with this. It creates a lot of problems. So how do I make my money? Well, if you like this show, it's very simple. We do it the PBS format. I ask you for a donation, but I'm not going to ask you for a lot. Or, well, all you have to do is, if you have $1 or $2 in your pocket, take it out, put it in an envelope. I'll give you the address. It will be in the description of my channel. Go to the channel description, go to About, and you'll see the address to send the $1 or $2 that you send. All I'm asking for, $1 or $2. If you got $1 or $2 in your pocket, stick it in an envelope. Send it to iNN. That's iNN. The address is 87 Telson Road. It's 87 Telson, Telson Road. That's in Markham, Ontario. Postal code is L3R184. And I thank you for your support. Alrighty.
iNN, promote, inform, and change. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Pagan Christians, you say? The Christian right are pagans. They're really pagans. And yes, they are. They say, I believe in Christ. But what type of Christ do you believe in? Show me your theology. When you look at your theology, and I can show you definitely that it is not the original Christ that you're believing in. It is an altered form of Christ. And that altered form is in the form of paganism. It is a pagan God with the face of Christ. It is a Christian paganism. It is not the original Christianity. And this is why you still have a cause for war within the Christian right. If it was originally Christian, there would be no cause for war within Christianity. There is no cause within war for Christ. Within the first 300 years of Christianity, Christ was based on the idea, the political view, the theological view that we were immortal. Christians are going to get immortal. We are immortal. That death is not real to us. That it is simply a veil. It is a thing we pass through on our way to our next life. So Christians don't die. There was no need to defend yourself. And in the first 800 years, We see that with the Christians. They went to their death. They did not protest. They did not fight. They did not blow up. They did not blow up their attackers. They went willingly to their deaths. But is that when the European Christians took over, when they took over the church, they fundamentally changed this and created a cause for war. And of course, the army of God was no longer an army of peace, no longer an army dedicated to eternal life spiritually. They were looking at the physical. They had rejected the physical. They had rejected the spirituality of Christ. They had rejected the spirituality of heaven. They wanted the physical heaven. They wanted a physical kingdom. Just the way the rabbinical Jews in the New Testament, when they crucified Christ, they crucified Christ because Christ was disturbing the kingdom that they had created on earth. He was disturbing their authority. And the Jews weren't waiting for an entrance into heaven. They were waiting for a kingdom on earth. They expected a king to come and lead them into battle and to take over the world. They wanted the world for themselves. This is the rabbinical narrative today. This is what you see in the rabbinical narrative today. It is physical. It is earthly bound. It is no longer looking at the events of heaven. Heaven is no longer concerned within the rabbinical Judaism. And this is how a lot of the horrors come out of it, where you do have the particularly with people in power, particularly with rabbis and your leaders. This is how they're allowed to sexually abuse people. This is how they're allowed to own people, that they have slaves. And we see the same thing popping up in the Quran, that we see the slavery still existing in there. The Christians who had removed slavery from their life, who had adopted their slaves as their own children, just the way God adopted us as children. The Christians were to do the exact same thing. In the first 800 years, Christians were forbidden by law to own slaves. They had to adopt any slave or servant that they had in their household. They had to adopt as family. This was the early Christian church prior to 800 AD. After 1000 AD, after the Roman Catholic Church finally started gaining control, that was no longer the system. They created a feudal system where the papacy owned everything, including people. They brought back slavery. This is true of the Calvinists. The Calvinists, who were the slave traders, who emerged from the Catholic environment. Calvinism emerged from the Catholic environment, believing that Christians could own slaves, no problem, if they were wealthy enough. Their view is God predestines things. If you're a wealthy person, then you are predestined to own and do whatever you want to do. You're already saved. You don't have to do anything more. The Quran has the exact same view. If you are wealthy, if you are a leader, you are favored by God. You have the fate of God with you. And you do not have to do anything more. Anything you do to your lower people, there's no problem. This is a situation of wealth. We see this within the Hindu caste system. The high people can own low people. And this is exactly what we see. And this, we look and say, oh, this is not true of liberalism, but it is true of liberalism. The high people own low people. Look at Hollywood. Look at the way the Hollywood system works. It is exactly the same method. And Hollywood does produce the demand for sexual abuse. Well, no. We have our laws. We are very strict about things, and we teach our children about consent. Okay, let's look at the research then. I went to take a look at several reels of research for sexual abuse in Europe. What do we see? As sexual tolerance in Europe goes up, so does sexual slavery. The trafficking of women and children for sexual purposes goes up when you go into the sexually liberal areas. The more sexually liberal the area, the higher the trafficking. And part of the problem has to do with the psychology. If you beat a person enough in order to survive the person starts to put a smile on them. They become psychologically conditioned to the environment that they're in. This is known psychologically. This is a known factor. So when you look at a sex worker and they seem happy about their environment, that's psychological conditioning created by the environment. That is not consent. And this is the problem here. When you go into court, the court does not consider the psychological conditioning. They only look at the initial verbal word of consent. Yes, I consent to this. You see that initial consent, then the person has consented to it. You cannot charge the pimp, you cannot charge the man, you cannot charge the abuser with abuse. And so you can have these show arrests where they swoop in with these SWAT teams and arrest a whole bunch of different people. But what is the outcome? What is the judicial outcome of this? The judicial outcome of this is nothing. More often than not, the people walk away time served. Why? Because rape does not exist on the left, because human beings do not have a soul. We are animals. If we do not have a soul, there is no psychological consequence. And the thing is, and they show they actually point to the psychological conditioning. You see, these people are happy now. There is consent here. They do not look at and consider. They refuse to consider that this is the happiness of the people that are being seen is a result of the psychological conditioning to the horrors that they exist in. This is refused. This is ignorance. This is the ignorance of the left, and they will blanketly refuse to acknowledge this. They won't even take the attempt to learn this stuff. Most people, when I talk to the left, you ask them about their studying. They don't do any studying. They don't want to study. Why don't you want to study if you're on the left? You're so-called intellectual. Simply because you find out that what you think you know, you really don't know. You find the reality of what you really are. And if you're on the left, you are an abuser. You are a sexual abuser. You are a rapist. You are this mean individual. You are a hater. You are exactly the things you state that you are not. In other words, on the left, it is not about what you do that defines you. It is about what you say that defines you. In other words, they allow hypocrisy to exist on the left. Hypocrisy is the motto on the left. Do what I say, not what I do. And ironically enough, they point back to the Christian right, and as they were basically fundamentally pagan, and say, well, this is Christianity. How these moral people here who say they have morals, behind the scenes they have no morals whatsoever. And you see that these people have no morals whatsoever. You see that they are abusing children. You see that they are sexually using children. You see the abuse there. This is seen. And I said this is what we see as the evils of politics. And this is where you go back and say, this is where you have Christian paganism. These Christians, these so-called Christians, are not really Christians. That they are pagans. You see the pagan war gods. You see the pagan sacrifices. You see the pagan views of sexuality within their existence. You understand this is the Illuminati. These are the Masons. This is the secret society. This is Kabbalism. And all of a sudden, these moral people are no longer moral. And this creates a huge problem. Because now you have disbelief in authority, and they need to find a way. And this is what's happening with the internet. Information is all over. People can get any information they want to. And trust in authority is breaking down. So what do? When trust in authority, you create Ferguson. You create the Border Patrol, and you create the TSA, and you see with the Stanley Milgram experiment how far you can push control over people. And the United States, under Obama, has pushed this control unbelievably far. And we will take a look at this. We'll start taking a look, breaking this down. We will look at both the left and the right. We will see how they break this stuff down. And get people to do horrible things to each other. Horrible inhumanity, by their own definition, because they no longer believe in anything. Nothing is believed in anymore. And I can demonstrate very clearly, again using India, that when this starts happening more and more, that our society is going to become a living hell. The way out, education. Just the way you can educate a person into being sexually abused, you can educate children into sexual abuse. You know, you prime them, you prepare them for sexual abuse, you groom them for sexual abuse like a pedophile does. This is what sexual education is doing now. It's creating the sexual child, the sexual being. And I'll demonstrate this. Show you people who actually believe in the sexualization of children, who say there's nothing wrong, that children are sexual beings. And they'll stand up and say, but I don't believe in trafficking. But if you believe in the sexuality of children, then you are a pedophile. No matter whether or not you are not a pedophile, if you believe in the sexualization that children are sexual beings, and you're photographing this, you are a pedophile. Period. And there will be psychological consequences to this. This is what we see as our society, and particularly as the youth become more sexual. What do we see? We see more suicides. We see more cuttings. We see more distress within the youth today. And then in many cases, many youth they don't have a positive outlook on life. They have a very dark outlook on life. This is where you have the goth, who believe that the world is dark, that the world is useless, that there is no more hope. The world is a dark place because in many cases the adults they see around them are dark. They are liars. There is no truth. And when they try to find the truth, it's very muddled. It's very difficult. It is not an easy thing. And that's why for this, my step forward is to reach out to the sex professionals of Canada. To begin there and say, if you want a better life, start watching this program. I'll teach you things in here. You're not going to learn everything all at once. Don't worry about what you understand at the beginning. As you watch this, the more you watch this, the more you'll understand. Knowledge is incremental. And you do not have to take notes. You just sit there, watch this. And the more you watch the program, the more you go back and watch the older programs too. The more you watch this, the more you'll get to know. And you will begin to understand things. You will be able to start writing things down. You will be able to write essays. And you will start having new horizons, new options that didn't exist before to you, but they were there, you just didn't see them. New options will open up and you will have new opportunities to change the way you live, to provide a new choice for your own life. This is my solution here. My solution on the way out is education. But free and open education. It's not going to cost anything. And I hope that the sex professionals of Canada will take this up. I hope they will make an effort to provide this to as many sex workers who want it, to sort of encourage them that if there's a problem, if they don't like what they're doing, if they really do want to make a change, well, this is your first step out. It's not going to change overnight. It's not going to change things overnight, but it does present a path towards progress. It does provide a path towards option. It does provide a path out. And this is what I'm talking about, stepping forward. More and more I will be doing this. I'll be providing more and more options as the weeks go by. Anyways, my name is Dr. Daniel Karras. I thank you for watching this edition of iNN's Headlines and Beyond, where we take and look at the events that are going on in the news and give you a deeper understanding of what's going on and how they interact or sit within a historical context. Anyways, have a good day. Bye-bye.
Welcome to the library, and I am the librarian. I am the professor. And professor of what? Professor of physics.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
Free speech rules here at Democratic Earth.